Okay, so we're going to get started. It's 2 o'clock. Happy Wednesday, everybody, about halfway through the week. Thanks so much for taking time out of your schedules to join us on today's webinar about disaster recovery plans for a pandemic and unexpected setbacks. I would definitely say this whole thing has been one giant unexpected setback. Before we do get started, just some housekeeping items. We are fully remote. We're all doing this from our homes, so if there's any sort of issue with internet or kids or dogs or pets or whatever, we apologize ahead of time. I did have an issue with internet earlier today, and I only learned that because if you have kids, you might know who Blippi is on YouTube, and Blippi stopped working. So that was a problem, probably worse than not being able to access stuff for work. In any event, we'll get into some things here. Shane, if you want to progress, there we go. It looks like from attendance, most folks know who Swick is. However, there are some people in the room that do not know who Swick is, or maybe you're just learning about us. So we want to just take a minute to say, first and foremost, I miss all these goofy people in this picture quite a bit. It's been far too long since we've been physically together at the office. But we've all been working remote and using this particular platform, Teams, as our way to stay connected and working. But we've been in business for about 15 years, and we have just shy of 30 employees in totality. And really a Microsoft shop. We believe in Microsoft best and documentation and putting our people first and our clients first and that kind of thing. So a little bit about Swick and who we are. If you have any questions after this, please reach out. We'd be happy to cover that. For those that don't know, my name is Eric Clark. I am one of the Client Success Associates at Swick. I've been with Swick for about 3 years. And joining me on the webinar today, I'll let them introduce themselves.
My name is Calvin Pallett. I'm a senior systems engineer at Swick Technologies. I've been in IT for 15 years, with 7 of those years being at Swick Technologies. And I've been responsible for managing and maintaining our backup systems for 5 of those years. And I will be assisting today and moderating the chat. So if anybody has any questions, just feel free to post them and we'll get an answer for you.
Great, thanks, Calvin. And I'm Shane with Eric. I also am in a client success associate role. What that means is kind of an account management position. I work with a lot of our clients to help make sure that we get them the right tools and technology that they need for their business.
Thanks, guys. So moving on to our agenda, just to kind of set some expectations around what we're going to be covering today. This is a pretty high level overview of data backup and disaster recovery. So for the technical folks in the room, we're not going to do any real show and tell of how to deploy a Veeam agent or Cloud Connect or something like that. We will touch briefly on those things, but this is more of a broad stroke. And we're happy to answer any questions in the Q&A as we kind of move along throughout the presentation, but again, also at the end. That's why we did bring Calvin in as a moderator to help answer maybe some more of the technical questions that might come up. And so far as the agenda, we're going to cover some data backup options to ensure 0 bytes lost, disaster recovery strategies to restore the most important systems immediately, so trying to help prioritize what that could look like. We're also going to cover some things with Microsoft 365 and other SaaS cloud backups and security measures around that, and how a business continuity and disaster recovery plan works to bring your business back after disaster. So those are some of the high points that we're going to cover. And it's important to call out why we think we should be talking about this as a business. Currently, Swick protects 275 plus terabytes of data for over 600 endpoints, and those are primarily servers, for over 165 clients. And it's interesting to say over 15 years because we really haven't been tracking all of that for the full life cycle of the past 15 years. This is more of some of the recent numbers that we have currently. So those numbers are much greater, but this is what we have tracked, and I thought it was worth calling out because we do have 0 bytes lost. And those are some neat numbers that we were able to pull for this presentation. Before we dive too deep into some things, we wanted to call out a few definitions. We're going to be throwing some of these terms around throughout the webinar, and we thought it'd be important to call some of them out. So we're going to go through these in this order. If we talk about recovery point objective, it's referred to as RPO. This really is the at what point do you want to recover to? Meaning, if maybe let's just use a file, for example. If I'm working on a Word document or an Excel spreadsheet, do I want to be able to recover to the last 5 minutes? Yesterday, when was the last time that backup ran, and how can I recover to that? Hopefully it's not 2 weeks or months or years or whatever, but that's what that refers to. The next one on the list is recovery time objective, also known as RTO. So what can the business tolerate in terms of being down? And it's not to say that it's the entire organization. In some cases, it might just be a department. So that could be sales, customer service, accounting, engineering, etc. But specifically also what applications, QuickBooks, maybe a line of business software application, like if you're manufacturing, that could be Epicor or SAP or something. So how long can you tolerate those things being down? That's recovery time objective. Things that are important to consider. And when we talk about silent failures, my way of understanding this that I'll articulate is really, let's just pretend you have a checklist of 10 items, and you see that checklist and you have, let's just say you have 10 green check marks. So it looks like everything worked, but there might be things that didn't even make it to that checklist, so to speak, that might be failing or not running properly. So just think about it that way, that you need to check for things that might not be alerting you that there's a failure. So maybe the alerting system itself is not functioning properly or having a problem. So not seeing that alert might indicate there is a problem. So we've run into that when we set up in other environments. We try to identify those things and set it up properly so the alerting works, so that that failure is actually bringing it to someone's attention, so someone can address that. Next is something called an air gap or a digital air gap. The image here in the corner is a fire break. Similar concept. You want to get your data off of your network in, especially with COVID and the spike in ransomware outbreaks, which we did a webinar on a couple weeks back. Those things have increased significantly, and they were already a problem. We want to get your data off of your network, so if some bad actor makes their way in there or something else happens, it's protected outside the network, kind of like this fire break here, that it can't hop off and get to it. So that traditionally can be done. If we talk about like people taking a hard drive off site or something like that and bringing it home, that's a more traditional way. There's obviously some more modern ways through cloud. And this fun page of memes, we couldn't just pick one. They were all too good. So if you're in technology in some capacity, these are comical, but also really true. It's something, that we wanted to call out, that it is very critical and important, something that Swick takes incredibly seriously.
Great. Thanks, Eric. With those definitions kind of underway, we're going to go ahead and get a little bit more technical. As Eric alluded to, we're not going to dive too deep into the ins and outs of how to set up backups and disaster recovery solutions today, but we do want to highlight, what those are and how you can use them for your business. So just a quick note before we dive into this backup slide here. I do want to call out the backup piece we'll be talking about today is more about the actual process of backing up and the products you can use to back up your data. And then later on, we'll get into more of the disaster recovery business continuity piece of this. That's not just a backup product, right? That's going to be kind of more of a full contingency plan for your business and using different technology to set that up. So diving into server backups, we just want to call out there's a lot of different kinds of backups, right? So you can have on-site backups that are going to be to maybe a physical hard drive in the environment, maybe a specific backup appliance, or another dedicated backup server that all of your other servers are backing up to. You can also have off-site backups, so that's going to be where your backups go to a data center or a cloud environment like Microsoft Azure or Amazon Web Services. Or maybe even to just somewhere else offsite, like a home office or another network. Maybe you have a secondary location for your business and you store them at that other location. And then most importantly, you can have both of these, right? You can have an on-site solution if that's the quickest, easiest way to restore your data, and an off-site solution to make sure that your data is air-gapped and kept safe from your environment. So, it's probably pretty simple to say, why do we back up? Obviously, to save those files, but just to give you some examples, you may want to restore one individual file or email that someone may have deleted accidentally or gotten rid of, or in the event that a server fails, whether that be physical hardware failure or you have a malicious attack on your environment, you can be able to restore that entire server or that entire environment to the infrastructure. So when you're backing up your files, as Eric alluded to with the silent failure aspect, we do want to make sure that our backups are backing up, right? So you want to make sure you have an audit process in place to test that. You should know who does it, and if maybe that person's on vacation or something, have a backup person that does it. And how often are you checking to make sure your backups are done, right? So if you're backing up weekly, you should probably check that they're completing when you know they're being backed up. If you're backing up daily, maybe you have someone go in and check every single day. Here at Swick we do backup daily, and we have Calvin and a team of backup experts that kind of review our backup environment to make sure everything is operating smoothly. So just to call out, these are a handful of different backup vendors. They offer a lot of different solutions, right? You could have maybe an appliance on site from some of these vendors that would be more of a capital expenditure up front that you're going to purchase. And you have to take into things like the warranty and the hardware that you have on site if you have that type of solution. And then alternatively, a lot of these vendors and other vendors also offer more of an operating expenditure where you pay some sort of monthly subscription or fee to utilize their software to back up your environment. To whether that be another server or offsite to cloud or another environment. It's important to just know the different styles, right? So a lot of these vendors will offer both appliances that are on site or just a solution to back up your data offsite. So just keep that in mind as we go here. All right, so one example that we want to call out is Veeam. We at Swick use Veeam a lot, and so I want to get a little technical and just show you some of the different options that we have with them. So the first one being a Cloud Connect agent. This is the type of scenario where you'll install an individual agent on each system that you're backing up. And then there's the Veeam Backup and Recovery solution, which is where you'll have a separate server that's going to target the servers in your environment, whether you're backing them up to a cloud or virtual or physical infrastructure. There's a lot of aspects to keep in mind when you're setting this up, whether it be through an agent or a separate server environment. You're going to want to keep in mind the speed of your internet, the bandwidth of your internet, how much data are you backing up, and how many different servers you're backing up. Those are going to be a lot of considerations to help you decide which version of Veeam or any other backup solution you're going to want to use. So what if you need to restore from backup, right? That's a scary prospect, but it's certainly a scenario that happens to people. And so we want to talk through what that's going to look like. So if you have your backup files, whether they're on a separate appliance or in the cloud, any number of the options we mentioned earlier, you have kind of four main ways that you can restore your environment. If possible, and your physical server is still operating, whether, depending upon what happened to your data, you can restore right back to that physical server or a new physical server in the environment. If your hardware failed, you may want to go with route number 2 and just get a temp server, whether that be from your IT provider or maybe purchase a new server and restore it back onto a temporary server environment for the meantime. And then option number 3 is maybe it makes more sense to restore to a local data center, what often is referred to as private cloud, right? A lot of IT service providers will have a private cloud space that you could possibly back it up to. Swick is an example of that. We have a data center space here in the Milwaukee area. And just kind of a little side story to how that can be valuable. We've had a client in the past who had an office in a location near a hurricane, and we weren't sure, what was going to happen with the hurricane situation. And so we reached out to that client and discussed options. We ended up moving all of their data via backup. So we restored it into our data center so that they had a separate instance of that running in our data center rather than at the location in case the hurricane was going to hit. So that's a good example of why you might want to do that route. And then option number 4, very similar to a private cloud or a data center, is restoring to a cloud environment, right? So there's Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud Platform, Amazon Web Services. Those are all going to be great resources to host your data in the event that you have to restore. So server backups aside, we do want to touch on other important data, right? So there's going to be a lot of scenarios where maybe there's individual workstations in your environment where someone has, design files or CAD files that they have and they're storing them on that computer. If that's a necessity, right, maybe your network isn't quick enough to store those files on a file share, or maybe there's another business reason to keep those on an individual computer. You just want to be aware of that, right? You want to keep in mind that you should be backing those files up, and there are tools to do so. We use Backblaze. That's a good example of a kind of an individual computer backup tool where you can, very similarly to servers, you can do daily or weekly backups of the system to save those files. And then the other big one is Microsoft 365 backups, right? So a lot of people use Microsoft Office 365 nowadays for their email or storing files in OneDrive or SharePoint and Teams. And while Microsoft obviously has some redundancy and uptime requirements for that data, there are scenarios where it's not going to be as easy to restore that information unless you're manually backing it up. So a good example of this is if someone deletes their folder structure in their inbox for their emails, or maybe deletes a folder on their OneDrive. Veeam offers a backup solution where you can go in and restore that one individual file or folder right back to the way it was before. Whereas if you don't have a separate backup solution, it's going to be a lot harder to get it back to the way that that person was using their environment. You can restore those files within a certain amount of time, but it's just going to dump all of those emails back into the inbox or all of those files right at the root of their OneDrive, and they're going to have to go through and resort and organize that. So those are two other important pieces of backups. And I'm going to pass it back to Eric here to talk a little bit more about disaster recovery.
Thanks, Shane. I did want to kind of circle back on one of the slides that you had touched on, like having network connectivity issues or making sure you have the bandwidth to support a recovery. I think it was slide 17, you talk about restoring from a backup. What do people need to consider for internet bandwidth, for bottlenecks and things like that, or actually retrieving their specific file folder structure? Is that something that we touched on?
Yes. Is that this?
I think it was just in here, baked in a little bit. I just wanted to make sure we called out, ensuring you have, proper internet speeds to handle something like that. If you are coming from a cloud environment, whether that's recovering or backing up to, like, can you handle that? What does the network infrastructure look like? Is that a bottleneck? Just making sure that you're not going to take so long to recover from something if you have to pull data from somewhere offsite.
Yes, that's absolutely something to consider, especially when, kind of before you set up this entire backup process, right? You're going to want to kind of get that concept in place so that you aren't in a scenario where you can't meet your recovery time objective.
Cool. That was it. Thank you. One of my favorite things is analogies, so I'm going to go over a few of those, but honestly, the mentality of it only happens to other people, and it's not going to happen to me. I do a lot of the sales for Swick Tech outside sales and some inside sales too. I go to a lot of different prospective kind of meetings and discovery meetings, and the number of times I cannot count on two hands. If I've asked someone, what are you doing for backup, and they point to some closet and say, yeah, I don't know, we're doing something, it's in the closet there. When's the last time you checked it? I don't know, I don't do that, or we're not sure, or so-and-so takes it home in their purse. Well, has she brought it back? Oh, I think it's been in her purse the last 2 months. Things like that. It can happen to you, and when it does, it's a disaster. If the train falls off the tracks, it could get pretty messy pretty quick. And so when we talk about disaster recovery and business continuity, is a very holistic thing. It takes into account for the entire business, but disaster recovery is the foundation of that as far as we would look at it. So having a plan in place and documenting that plan, these are business decisions, and you don't want to be kind of tied to some sort of technical limitation. Let the business make that decision and then map the technology to that business decision. So determining what that priority is and all of those things is really important. And then when we talk about some of these items, there's some more definitions that I want to cover, just because there is a gray line between some of these, and I want to just make sure we spell it out very clearly. Some of the definitions we're going to cover really quick are backup, which sounds a little redundant per the presentation we're covering, but then also failover, high availability, which can be graded with failover, and then disaster recovery itself. When we talk about backup, and backup is like taking a photo of the content of your computer, so if anything happens, it's all safe. And for the IT folks in the room, I don't mean to patronize, but I want to just make sure we're spelling it out. Essentially, you're saving copies of your data at a certain date and time, which could range from a few hours ago to a few days ago, depending on the specific organization's practice. It's important to have data backed up or a data backup solution in place, but it can be an isolated solution, or sorry, cannot be an isolated solution. So when we go to the next definition and we talk about failover, the analogy that comes to mind for me that I felt like I wanted to articulate here is it's like a spare tire. So when you get a flat tire, you switch to the spare and you keep going. And some spares are really only meant to take you to the nearest tire shop, but others are the same as the original tire. And in the IT world, that generally means there's a computer ready to run your mission critical programs, and you can just switch that computer when your system goes down to continue working until the original system can be fixed by someone in IT. So failover helps preserve business continuity while IT fixes the problem, and there's different levels of failover you can deploy depending on what the objectives are and what you can tolerate. So a lot of this is really planning and talking about what you can tolerate, what you want to get away with, because the tighter these tolerances are, the more horsepower, the more money and investment. So there is some give and take there based on what you want to achieve. And when we talk about high availability, this is a protocol that's designed for companies that can't tolerate a disruption. So maybe there's a publicly traded company that has on the stock exchange or something like that, and a disruption to that business continuity could be detrimental. So certain machines can be configured to reduce any downtime, and it aims for little to no human interaction to restore operations to that system. So if a failure might happen, but it's automated to just correct itself almost instantaneously. So high availability and failover are often confused because failover is typically how availability is implemented, but they are not the same and can be used independently. So again, this is a conversation that the business needs to have in terms of what you can tolerate and what you want to get out of it based on what your objectives are and what you can tolerate. Disaster recovery is the only disaster recovery. This cannot be confused with backups. And this is the conversation when I go out and I meet with prospects and clients and things of that nature, where they get conflated and kind of grouped and lumped together. So an analogy that I think helps spell this out is, I guess I've heard a lot of people say, yeah, we have a disaster recovery plan. We back up our data once a day. That does save your data. It's not a solution for business continuity. Backing up your data does ensure that you can access it eventually. But when you have a real disaster recovery plan in place, businesses can continue as normal much more quickly. So think of it like this. If you save all of your personal data to the cloud, let's pretend we're talking about your iPhone. So maybe you have your music, your photos, and anything you want to keep. Your phone breaks, you drop it out of your purse, you drop it in a lake, whatever happens. So you go buy a new phone. You still have your data from the previous phone in the cloud, but only after setting up a new phone at the cell phone store, working with their people to get it all configured. So you still have to log in with all of your credentials, read down all of your apps. And today, these things have been made easier, so this analogy isn't maybe the best fitting. But you still have to configure it to your needs. So spending that time downloading that information from the cloud is going to take some time. Disaster recovery is like having a mirrored backup phone that you can turn on and go to and get back to posting, whatever you're posting. If it's a cell phone, it's, maybe vacation pictures to Facebook or something, whatever. The idea being that just because your data is backed up, the time it takes to get things back to the way they were up and running the way that you expect them in the places that they need to be with the access you need to have for yourself and all of your employees, that's the disaster recovery. So those are some of my analogies that I felt like explaining for definitions. When we talk about a disaster recovery concept, this list is not fully exhaustive, but these are some key components that we defined. I won't read them off to you all. You can read the screen. But three major, just simple takeaways is just make sure this is easy to implement and follow. Make sure that anyone can follow it, or anyone that's supposed to can. If someone that's dealing with this is out of the office on vacation or whatever they're doing, that's probably when it's going to happen anyways, of course, because of Murphy's Law. But you want to make sure that it's very straightforward and simple to follow. So the next out of the three in terms of simple things to consider is redundancy. So save your information in different ways in different places. If something happens that affects your geographic location, your data backed up on the cloud is still accessible. Make sure you can get to it. Physical copies, but physical copies might not be. Also, backups, even if they're tested, can still fail. So make sure that you have a backup of your backup. Calvin, in your seat, I'm sure you can attest to that. Make sure that when you backed up is actually working and you have a backup of that if you can. And then lastly, round the clock availability. Disasters rarely are polite, as we know. They can happen any time. The hurricane example that Shane referenced is, that's not going to adhere to some sort of business schedule or calendar. So you need to take stock of making sure you're ready to deal with this any time of day, weekend, whatever.
Great. Thanks, Eric. So I do want to get a little bit more technical. We won't dive too far into the weeds on this recovery solution, but we just wanted to call out some of the things that Eric just mentioned, right? You can see in this graphic, this is an Azure site recovery solution, right? And it's calling out failover, high availability, disaster recovery. It's showing replication, right? You have your data in multiple regions. And you can see here that this is kind of a structured approach to having your servers and your databases backed up in your environment up to an off-site solution like Azure Site Recovery. I don't want to, get into the specifics of each of these items, but this is kind of how you would lay out your plan for disaster recovery for the IT or technology piece of that recovery solution. So, a lot of people might ask, why would I use site recovery technology like Azure Site Recovery or Amazon Web Services over a traditional backup? And there's a few reasons. Really, it's going to protect you better against technical and physical threats, right? So if your building burns down, something like that, and you have your data in a site recovery, it's going to be a lot more easy to spin that data up and get your employees back working. And then also, it's very secure, right? So those large companies that have those cloud site recovery solutions are ensuring that data is encrypted and secure so that it's protected even if something were to happen in your environment. So before we kind of jump into questions and an opportunity for you to chat with Calvin a little bit more, we do want to call out a few next steps that you can do for if you're just starting out in your backup solution, or maybe you're responsible for your backup environment and your disaster recovery plan. Maybe you're new to the business and you don't know it and you want to kind of dive in. So some next steps to review are your backup platform. Do you know what backup platform you're using and how it works? And then is there any business critical data not being backed up, right? So we mentioned earlier, maybe people have stuff saved locally on their workstations and it shouldn't be, right? Maybe that data should be on a server that's being backed up already. So make sure you know where your data lives and whether or not it's being backed up. That goes back to the Microsoft Office environment too, right? A lot of people have their email in a cloud solution, but don't know if it's being backed up or not. So just kind of follow where your data is and if it's being backed up. And then have you determined what your business's RPO and RTO are, right? So you need to sit down with maybe some key decision makers at the company and decide how long are we willing to have our backups be saved, and how long are we willing to wait to get those backups up and running if something happens. And then are your backup and DR solutions being confirmed and tested, right? While we all know technology is great and there's a lot of automated processes and alerts, we also know that it can fail sometimes without warning us. And so do you have someone physically testing and confirming to make sure your backup is being completed on a regular basis, or that your disaster recovery solution is operational in the event you need to actually use it? And then we also wanted to call out our next webinar. So in 2 weeks, same time, same Microsoft Teams platform, we'll be having another webinar, and we have a special guest joining us, Todd McLeese from the Pendio Group. We'll be talking on planning for emergence from the COVID-19 recession. So how can you help your business emerge stronger after everything that has happened recently? And with that, we want to kind of switch gears and give you guys a quick opportunity to ask any questions that you might have. We're more than happy to dive into some more technical details or not. Whatever you kind of have, feel free to post it, and Kelvin and Eric and I will be happy to answer.
I think, Shane, if you're chatting, you might be muted.
Thanks, Eric. That's helpful. So the questions take a little time to trickle in here, but up front, we'll go ahead and just kind of start out with this process and give you a question for Calvin to answer. So Calvin, do you mind kind of just sharing what you've seen as some rules of thumb for RPO and RTO in businesses, depending upon what the needs of that business are?
Absolutely. Yeah, as far as RTO goes, there's a lot of factors that can go into it from a business decision-making standpoint. Usually what it boils down to is what is the absolute most amount of time, or the least amount of time that a specific department or the company itself could go without their critical business systems that are being backed up, essentially. A lot of backup products can take hours to days to restore, depending on the paradigm and the speed of the internet and all those other factors, the amount of data. So in many cases, like it can be something that could cripple a business. If they go more than 2 days where the production floor can't run without their label software, without, whatever example you can think of. So that's a real driver as far as the RTO. If you can't be without that system for 4 hours, well, then we need to try and devise a solution that will restore data within 4 hours. So in those cases, like a cloud-based product, while it's good for getting data offsite and that air gapped and all that stuff we talked about, that may be a paradigm where we want to have a local server or appliance or something to do a quick restore, because you're not then susceptible to the speed of the internet or internet going down entirely. As far as RPO goes, again, dictated a lot by business needs, and oftentimes by for like legal purposes or for like legacy reasons. If you need to have 7 years worth of financials, well, then it might be a good idea to back up and have archives and snapshots of your financial data going back for 7 years, or whatever it is. So we typically default to 30 days with daily snapshots for each day, and then if a client decides that, oh, we want 30 days worth of backups with monthly archives, then we can do that. We can do yearlies. It's one of those things that it just having more recovery points typically just costs more money, whether that's space on the appliance, whether it's space in the cloud, whether it's tapes or hard drives. It's just you need more physical or virtual media to store all of those backups on. So cost is a big deciding factor as well, as far as with RPO.
Great, thank you, Calvin. And I do want to just call out to kind of give people some real world examples of both of those. So jumping back to recovery time objective real quick. A good example, maybe if you have like a customer service team that works with clients on billing, a lot of that information is going to be stored on an application server. And so if that server goes down, how long are you comfortable having your customer service staff have to tell clients, I'm sorry, I can't give you the information that you're looking for, right? That's like a good example of how long you're willing to be down until you get that data back up and running. And then an example on the recovery point objective side is, let's say you do daily backups, right? So at 1 a.m. every day you take a backup. So it's Tuesday at 1 a.m. and we've got a backup of our data. And then are we okay if at noon that day something happens before that data is re-backed up and we lose those 4 to 6 hours of work depending upon what time you start work? Are we willing to lose that time, right? So some businesses would say, no, I'm not willing to lose that time and data that my staff put in that morning. I want a backup to be done, 15 minutes, every 15 minutes, so that if something happens at noon, I can go back to 11:45 instead of 1 a.m. So those are just some good examples to kind of get the brain turning on how you should approach RPO and RTO. So we do have a question posted here that Calvin, I'd like you to answer. How many copies of backups should you have? I think when we're asking this, we're referring to copies of the same data, right? The same snapshot.
Yeah, that's a good question. It can vary depending on the backup technology, and if you are verifying backups and if you have multiple archives and different things, the more copies of a backup or of any specific backup set that you have, that can definitely be a good thing. I've seen many cases where a client has 400 tapes and a stack of drawers or different things, and well, we've got all these, hopefully we can find what we're looking for, and sure as shooting, we go through it all and we'll find that obscure backup from that specific day and time and from 5 years ago that they needed that specific file in that specific version. But again, it kind of comes down to what the business needs are and just overall costs, because obviously to have 400 tapes sitting in a drawer somewhere, that there's definitely a cost associated with that. And as we've moved towards more cloud-based and online-based backup products, the equivalent of that is definitely maybe not as achievable, of having every backup you've ever done and just putting it in a closet somewhere, because monthly recurring data storage costs definitely they keep adding up, especially as you keep adding more data to it. So I would typically advise, as far as like number of backup copies, to do like a 30 or 60 day set of backups, and then keep monthlies and then yearlies, and then
Calvin,
whether I'm sorry.
Well, I just wanted to jump in here. What about multiple copies of the same data, right? So if I back
Yep.
up daily at midnight, how many copies of that version should I have?
It can vary depending on what you're trying to achieve and where that data is stored. Like with Azure, the data could be replicated in two locations once it's, or reside in two locations once it's replicated, or depending on if you have a server on site, the data will live there and then it gets replicated off site, and then so it's in two spots as well. I would, again, coming back to the business needs, in the paradigm where you have a server on site and or an appliance and an offsite backup, that's by default going to be two locations. And it has the added benefit of having one of those locations be on the local network, which will allow for much quicker restores. Coming back to RTO basically as being a driving factor for that.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think that kind of covers it. It's, obviously a minimum of one is the answer, right? You want to have at least a backup, but you got to consider if you have something that's on site, you may also want off site, because if something happens to your physical environment, you're not going to be able to get that back.
What I would definitely advise is even more important. I would take one set of backup data, as long as it's verified daily and test restores are done on a basis of some, whether it's quarterly, monthly. I would take that over having 100 copies of the same data that hasn't been verified or checked and by somebody any day. That's just a little note I would add in there, because if the data is not good, it doesn't matter how many times you have it copied. So it's really important for somebody to be managing and maintaining the successfulness of the actual backups and then verifying that data after the fact.
Yeah, cool. Thank you, Calvin. So kind of a more unique and interesting question I think we've gotten. We'll see if we can tackle this one together. We save our backup in the OneDrive cloud. Should that suffice, or do we need more than just that OneDrive backup? So Calvin, I'll let you kind of start with that. I think what they're saying is they take a backup of their data, and then that backup, whatever medium it's on, is stored in their OneDrive account.
That's an interesting paradigm. I mean, OneDrive itself should have some redundancy to the data. So the fact that it's a backup itself that's being saved somewhere offsite, I would advise that might be okay. The thing that would jump out at me is that OneDrive probably isn't the most ideal place to store a backup. The problem is with OneDrive is it doesn't actually address the air gap. It is not air gapped. So with OneDrive, what you end up with a lot of the times is local mappings on workstations to OneDrive locations. So that is essentially like it's on the network, where it could fall subject to like a crypto attack or hackers compromising the workstation and having access to that data. And if they were looking around, they could see, oh, there's backups in here. So that would be my primary concern with that, would be it doesn't completely meet the definition of air gapping and keeping that backup data completely segregated and separated from the local network.
Okay, yeah, no, that's super helpful. Thanks, Calvin. I think one other note on that might be that the OneDrive environment isn't going to be like an easy solution to restore from, even in the event where maybe your physical environment is compromised or the server fails. You're going to have to grab that backup from OneDrive, and log in to your OneDrive on another server or computer that has some sort of restore platform, depending upon the solution that you used to back up that data, to then restore it. So it's just kind of an extra hurdle you may have to go through to restore your data as well. All right. Cool. Well, I don't see any more questions. I did want to take a quick moment just to jump back and show you guys we'll be back here at 2 p.m. again in 2 weeks, Thursday, May 21st. Okay, maybe I lied. Maybe it's Wednesday. I'm not. Ryan, can you maybe chime in and let me know for sure?
Yeah, it's Thursday. Yeah, Thursday, May 21st.
Okay, cool. So not Wednesday, May 20th, Thursday, May 21st, same time, 2 p.m. We'll be back here to show you guys a conversation with Todd McLeese and how you can emerge stronger from COVID-19 and the current recession that we're in. So thank you for joining us today. We're really happy to talk about these topics. If you do have a question that maybe you didn't want to post, or maybe it's just more of a business specific question, feel free to reach out to us directly at solutions@swicktech.com, or any other method you know to get a hold of us, and we'll be happy to discuss that with you and hopefully answer your questions and make sure your data is safe and that you have a recovery plan in case something happens.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks. We'll see you soon.